the bell has rung. So get seated and join Elementary Schooled for today's interview.
Welcome to Elementary Schooled. This is Season 1, Episode 15, and today I'm delighted that we are covering this topic. It is how to support military-connected students in their school environments. And today we have Jenn Rupp, who is a military educational therapist. I'm so glad to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation to come and share with you today. Thank you.
I'm so glad that this exists and it is already having an impact on our school, a very positive impact. So I really wanted to cover this topic and know that there is support of students in their normal school environment where they can get support and really feel that in the public school system or any school system. I will read your bio real quick. Jenn Rupp is a licensed clinical social worker and is a certified school social worker with the Utah State Board of Education. She is part of the new military support team with Davis School District. She is passionate about providing support to military families and brings her experience and knowledge to the table, helping military-connected students cope with the unique challenges of military life in an academic setting. Jenn grew up as an Army brat, following her dad around the world. She then met and married her husband, a United States Marine. They raised their 3 boys together through many deployments and moves. After 27 years of service, they retired to Utah. You have continued to stay connected to the military now as the mom of an Air Force officer and grandma to your military-connected grandchildren. Jenn knows firsthand that being a military family member is complicated. And I love this part. You understand the challenges and barriers that many military-connected students face, such as education gaps, deployments, and the mental health impacts of uprooting one's life time and time again. You are committed to helping military-connected students learn skills and gain the confidence they need to thrive in school and life. I just want to thank you and your husband for your service to the military and your commitment to that. What's that been like?
You know what? It has been a great pleasure. It has been, I'm not going to say it's been easy because it hasn't, but there has been so many wonderful things that have come out of it. Friends that I will cherish for life, opportunities for growth. I feel like I grew a lot. Just me personally, as well as professionally, and also as a mom. I recognized that I was the one constant in my kid's life because my husband was in and out. Their friends were in and out. Their school environment changed all the time. And I got to be that one constant. And so that was really a good thing. It was very helpful for me and meant a lot. But the military life was fun. We got to experience some great places, see some wonderful things. I've been to, from being a little girl and being in Germany to Japan as an adult, and then all over the United States. I've had a lot of fun in seeing different cultures and different environments.
What a true adventure. Would you call it that?
Absolutely would call it that. It's been a great adventure.
And experiencing education in different places.
Yes. Yeah.
So you are the perfect one for your role now. And we mentioned already, this is a new program. So this is a pilot program, and your role, I wanted to make sure I got your exact role right. You were called a military educational therapist. And like I said, it has had a direct positive impact on our school already. This is year 1. And you explained before we got started that this, the commitment our state has given is 5 years, but it's still kind of a yearly. Will you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So back last summer, Brian Garrett from the Utah Department of Veterans and Military Affairs had a lot of things that were brought to his attention, things that our military families are struggling with a little bit. Often these things are challenges families face with special education because you move with an IEP or a 504 from one state or from overseas with I'm going to call it a DODS school, which is the Department of Defense school. And those those things don't always transfer from school to school. And that becomes a difficult thing for families. And so there were challenges with IEPs, with 504s, just those special education needs, as well as there were concerns with academic gaps. And just we saw an increase in mental health needs, as well as behavioral health needs, not just with students in general, but our military connected students started to have a higher and higher one since we've had this war on terrorism that has been going on for such a long amount of time. Deployments have increased, the tempo of them have. And so students are dealing with constant changes in their lives. And so they said, we really need to do something to assist our military kids here in Utah. And our team was started October of this year. So already with the school year starting, we came on with 2 military educational therapists, which is what I'm one of those. Jordan Guy is the other one. And then Francesca Suarez is a military family advocate.
Will you talk about your own military background first and how it affected you and how you see the difference in how it's affecting students now as opposed to years ago?
Absolutely. Yeah. I grew up, like you said in my bio, as an Army brat. So my dad was in the military. He was in the United States Army, and he took us all over the United States. And probably my hardest move was my freshman year. We moved right in the middle of my freshman year, and we left from this big school, big community. And I went to this little small town in North Carolina. And everybody was connected, and I felt like the outsider. I didn't have connections, and that was super, super difficult for me. I remember feeling isolated and lonely and having to figure out, how am I going to get connected to this community that I felt like had been connected since they were in diapers. As far as the different challenges that we have faced or that I've seen, military connected kids, the one thing I want listeners to know is that they are resilient. Even when they struggle, they are very, very resilient. There are lots of social, emotional, and academic challenges that military connected children face. I kind of mentioned a little bit of that when I mentioned mine, but they're going to adjust to new school environments and new friends constantly. This population's highly mobile. Not all, but many are. And they're going to deal with lots of frequent moves and disruptions in their friendships. And this often is going to create those feelings of isolation, heightened feelings of stress, of that social anxiety of, oh man, I've got to now reconnect with a new group, or man, I don't want to leave these friends. And so sometimes you'll get to a new area and you're only going to be there 6 months. And it's like, why even try? And not only that, they have to adjust to that new school. Schools have their own language. When you move from state to state, those cultures and those languages and those rules are very different. Also, you're going to have academically, you're going to have where you might feel behind your peers because there's different curriculums, different teaching styles. You might move in the middle of the year and you might have gotten fractions at the first half of the year, but you didn't get decimals because of the way the curriculum was taught, or things like that. You'll find that often. Grading methods.
The curriculum might be similar, but the sequence of how it's taught could be very different.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it might be taught in different grades even.
How has your previous background helped you prepare, specifically working with elementary age children?
Yeah. So specifically with working with elementary kids, is I have been a school social worker for many years, and I have focused in the elementary setting. That is where my love is. I love elementary kids. To me, they are definitely, they want to learn. They want to learn those strategies and skills. Yes, you might run into those that are kind of, pushing against it and don't want to, but overall, they want to just find those connections. Also, being in a school setting for so many years, I recognize the challenges teachers face. That's not just one student. I might have the one student, but you guys have 24, 25.
What's the structure of the program like?
So our team, like I said, consists of 2 military educational therapists and then 1 military family advocate. And our roles are essentially very similar, but they're also very different. But they really complement each other. So as therapists, we are able to go into the school setting. We also have access to the teachers, to the kids in their environment. I'm able to get on the school system to be able to see what the discipline is and things like that those kids might be experiencing and struggles that they're having. And so we go into the school setting and we meet with the kids in order to help them build some strategies and skills to help them be successful in their academic and life in general, kind of helping them with that. So we provide that clinical intervention, those supportive services across the district. Those services include brief therapy as well as group therapy. Some of it might be crisis intervention or safety planning. A safety plan is very important. A lot of our little military kids really struggle with deployments and not understanding that sadness, or their person that there is their safe person is the one that is deployed. And, you know, a lot of times that brings on big feelings that they just don't understand, and it creates a conflict for them. And so kind of helping them deal with that crisis intervention is huge. Basically, our goal is just to help them succeed emotionally and socially and academically in their school environment. Now, our military advocate, on the other hand, her job is essential. You might think that therapist is really needed, but if our systems aren't in order, if our adults are struggling to regulate themselves, then that student is still going to have a hard time regulating, because we know kids regulate off the adults in their lives. And so if that family member is struggling, then they need some supports and helps. And that's where our family advocate comes in. Often she is our first member of our team to interact and engage with family members. And sometimes she just provides that listening ear.
And is she the first step, would you say?
Yeah, often. Sometimes actually it comes through the school. A lot of times that's the first step too. You guys know the students probably better than anybody else in that district setting. And so teachers make those referrals when you guys take them to your student success teams, recognizing that there is a military student, and then that referral may not go through the advocate, but the advocate.
So on our end, we just talk to our administrator and say, we have a military student and we would like to offer some support and help for the student and their family. And then it goes into your hands, and then however you split up that.
Mm-hmm. And help. That may be that I then call and I'm talking to the parent and I recognize, oh, really, they need some help with some other resources. And so then it backflows, and then it goes back to Francesca. So it's really this wraparound. We really complement each other, and it's very good. And then Francesca's other role is to really, she can go and sit in IEPs and 504s and help that bridge that needs to be there in helping to take that military voice and that understanding, but also the district understanding of what are our resources. Military members are often very nervous to get mental health supports. And the reason for that is a mental health diagnosis. Even though in a school setting, we as therapists are not diagnosing children, it's still scary for parents to say that my child had mental health services, because it can impact a rating for a family, a military family. So an exceptional family member program, EFMP, gets that rating based on certain things. One might be a physical need, a physical medical need. Maybe that student has asthma that's severe and they can't go to certain bases because they don't have the medical care they need. A mental health diagnosis will also create that EFMP rating. And then you will also have it for like an IEP or a 504, because academically, we need to make sure the schools can provide those supports and help. Now, sadly, when we get that rating, some people will say, that's going to impact my career. The service member might say that, because all of a sudden it might limit the base where they can go. And so that becomes tricky. Parents are nervous about getting sometimes that diagnosis. Okay. So that kind of gives you this big umbrella. That's in a very small kind of explanation of a big, huge concern.
So for example, if a child was diagnosed, I mean, I know you don't do the diagnosing, but if a child had attention deficit disorder, ADHD, then that could limit, because it would be on the rating system, and that could possibly limit what bases they can go to.
Correct. Or an autism diagnosis could create a where they're receive that rating, and then they know that they can only go to certain bases. Like Hill Air Force Base has an EFMP rating because we're so close to Primary Children's Hospital. We've got a lot of mental health supports. We've got good public schools. And so they can meet a lot of those exceptional family member program ratings. Okay. And so we'll see a lot of that here in Utah because it does meet that. But it limits that availability for service members to maybe get to go to certain places. And if their career is very specified, then all of a sudden they might not be able to go with their family to a certain location, and they have to go remote. They have to go without their family members. And so often that's a fear. So that's when I share that, kind of helping people to understand that, recognizes why this might be hard for families to want to get those mental health supports. In a school setting, we're able to address it as just school strategies and skills. I'm still providing mental health supports. I'm able to, as a trained licensed clinical social worker, still provide that same behavioral supports that they would get outside, but it's done in a brief therapy, just to provide strategies and supports that don't have to be connected to their military files or whatever you want to call it. And for years I have said we need something on district levels that can help our military connected kids transfer into a new school and get the supports that they need. Deal with, moms deploying, dads deploying, both parents are deploying, and what that looks like for the kids. Recognizing and telling a teacher, hey, this student's family is getting ready to move in a couple months, and those big behaviors you're seeing, they're sabotaging their relationships here. So all of a sudden you start seeing that they're fighting with their peers, and you're like, what is going on? But if they can make this not a good place, it makes it a lot easier to leave. So they're going to start sabotaging it. Not all kids do this, but it's a big thing that we see.
It's a coping strategy. I'm leaving, so I'm going to make this feel a little miserable, then it might be easier for me to leave. It kind of makes sense. Will you talk about the structure of the program in terms of how much time you would get individually? Like, what would that look like for a student? Is it once a week, twice a week? And if it's individual as opposed to group?
Yeah, so when a referral comes in, students are, and that's kind of that process where we're asking questions of parents, we're asking questions of the administration, and maybe the school counselors. So we're working very close together as a team. And then the decision's made whether it's going to be a stabilization, which is 1 to 3 visits, or whether it's going to be a brief therapy, 8 to 10 visits. And then it's kind of done on a weekly basis, where we'll come out into the school. We meet with the student for about 30 to 40 minutes.
Privately, they're pulled from their classroom.
They're pulled from their classroom. So, I try to avoid recesses and lunch because I know that's super important, especially to our elementary kids, to not miss recess. Group therapy is very similar. Group therapy is, we just need to have one military connected student. That's it. And then we ask that the administration and faculty talk together and find other kids that maybe need that same skill and strategy. And then they're grouped in. We find that helps kids connect to their communities, which is important. Other kids that are experiencing maybe similar issues. And so then they sit in group, and group is about 30 to 40 minutes for elementary. It's about 50 to 60 for secondary, and it's 6 to 8 weeks. Both, the way a therapy session will look is we'll do a check-in on an individual level. I use a Likert scale that I have kids tell me 1, things are absolutely horrible. 5, things are wonderful. How are things going with you personally? Your feelings, whatever you're dealing with. And they give me a number. How are things going at home? And I get a number. How are things at school? That's like your grades, how you interact with your teachers. And I'll get a number. And then everything else. Sometimes I'll know specifically I need to ask certain questions in that way. That kind of helps me gauge the session. We'll also do a check-in kind of with groups. So both start with a check-in. Then we do a introduction to a skill. And then we do an activity that reinforces the skill. Elementary seems to be a resilient one, not giving up, perseverance. So that's kind of been a big one for elementary schools, as well as our emotional regulation, kind of dealing with those big feelings, those heightened emotions, and not knowing how to deal with them. And then a lot of anxious thoughts. Those are our 3 big ones for elementary school.
Will you tell us and teach us a strategy or what you work on specifically when it comes to anxious thoughts?
Yeah. So one of the very first things, and this is just one of my favorite ones for anything from elementary to high school, is just kind of helping them recognize how heavy an anxious thought can be. Because sometimes it's really kind of helping them recognize that. And so I have them pick up a bottle of water and we talk about, is that bottle heavy? No, it's not heavy. I can hold this or whatever. And then I have them hold it straight out and we read a story. And then as they're reading that story, of course, that gets harder and harder. And I don't let them bend their arm, keep it straight out, keep it straight out. And then as we do this and we talk about it and we finish the story, we process, can they remember certain things about that story? And often they can't because their mind was so focused on that burden they were holding, that stress, that anxious thought. And then we talk about if we have more than one, how hard would that be? And so sometimes that's a strategy that just helps them recognize how that impacts the brain. And then we talk about the brain. And so that's one of my favorite strategies for anxious thoughts, as well as teaching them. Another session we do a lot with, is this in or out of your control? And I use a Play-Doh and a rock to help them with that. And so I hand them Play-Doh and I will say, with this Play-Doh in your hands, I'd like you to make me a nest with 3 eggs. And of course, kids can immediately make a nest.
They love that.
3 little eggs in it. And then I hand them a rock and I say, okay, with just what I hand you in your hands, make this into a nest with 3 eggs. And they look at me like, I can't do that. And we talk about, well, which one did you have control over? And they had control over the Play-Doh, but not over the rock. And then we are able to take whatever is bothering them, whatever worry, whatever concern, and we break that down into our circle of control. What can you control? What can you take care of in that problem? And then we list what are those things that you can't control. So if they're worried about, a dad being deployed, dad's deployment is on that outside. We can't do anything about it. Well, what can we control? Well, we can maybe call dad and set up a FaceTime. We can come up with a fun activity to do with dad, even though he's deployed. And so we talk about what that might look like and those connections. That's often for sadness, but it can be for anxious thoughts as well. Great, simple strategy.
It's a great strategy. I do want you to mention this one too, because we talked about it one day and I hadn't heard it before, but the scaffolding.
Yeah, so sometimes when we're talking and we're teaching coping skills to kids or just the different things, kids are having a hard time. And just like in education, you use scaffolding. You need to teach this skill.
Foundation.
This skill. I get kids to just kind of identify if, they've seen scaffolding outside, they've seen what that looks like on a building. And so we talk about how, they might have this level because of first grade and now second grade is here. But if we're not paying attention in class, we're missing that 3rd grade scaffolding. And if all of a sudden I take this scaffolding out, what's going to happen to 4th and 5th grade? And so they see this and they can visualize and it falls, and it kind of can help them recognize the importance of that engagement. we also use that with coping skills, where sometimes we're not way up here to use this big coping skill yet. We need to just start with the little ones. And sometimes those little ones are those little buildings of those scaffoldings.
I
And
like
so,
that because any analogy, anything they can hold, is perfect, but anything they can visualize is probably a close second to really understanding, especially with young kids. I do want you to mention this one too, the 2 by 10 strategy.
yes. So this is probably one of my favorite strategies, and it's one that I talk to teachers about. Remember when I said for kids, a lot of times they're leaving constantly something that they're familiar with, or their safe person might be deployed. Um, those connections, those relationships are very important. And so a 2 by 10 is taking 2 minutes, 10 days in a row to talk to that student about just random things, not anything that has to do with school, not, how are you doing in my classroom? How, nothing to do with the assignments, or, yep, you're missing a class assignment. Avoid that completely.
It's tell me about that Pokemon card, or how does this game work? Or did you end up playing in your baseball tournament this weekend? Or
and finding those connections. When kids can connect to you, then there's going to build this trust. And often that trust is what is missing, and we'll see those behaviors increase. And I'm not saying those behaviors aren't going to be there even with that trust, but it's going to make it easier for them to then come back to you and to know that you care and that you are connected to them. And I think that's what is important for militaries, for all students, but really for our military connected kids, because they've lost so many of those relationships over the year.
Yeah, their life is in too much transition and change that whatever they can hold on to, it's really critical that we meet that. Can you give an example of what you have seen, maybe with, since we're talking about elementary students, what you have seen and maybe some progress in their specific situation?
Yeah, so I'm going to give one of mine. And then if you don't mind, I wanted to share one of my colleagues, Jordan's, because it's not just, we're both working together on this. And so we often have kids with high behaviors. Those are probably one of the biggest things we get called in to support and help. And
just so listeners know what that means, a high behavior.
Yes. Yeah. So a high behavior might be that they've had lots of referrals because they're struggling to interact positively with their peers, or they're maybe trying to escape the classroom, or work avoidance to the point that that's creating problems in the classroom where they're, not connecting to their peers or whatever it might be. So just those escalated behaviors that are not essentially what we would say pro-social or helpful for that student. And so he shared that he had a second grader who really could not emotionally regulate. He is both parents. He came from a dual military family. So he had just recently been through this one deployment, then another deployment, then another deployment with different parents. So, I mean, imagine just the dysregulation in his family. Plus, he had recently moved to Utah. And so he would go from 0 to 100 in just like seconds. There was like no in between. But especially if he perceived that something bad was going to happen, or if he was disappointed, he wasn't called on in class, and then also it was this heightened behavior. He was a little firecracker as far as, like that bomb would just explode real quickly. And so as they worked through sessions and learning those coping skills, Jordan was able to help him learn how to anticipate and mitigate those explosive, he called them little dynamite explosions, I think is what he said. And they were able to see that over time, the intervention notes that were going in for him had decreased. And both his parents and his teachers acknowledged that, these simple skills, using the same terminology that he was using in those sessions, was helping to help him regulate before those explosions. And so that was one example. One for me.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah.
What a gift for that child and
Yeah.
that whole family and the classroom. It just has a domino effect. It really does, because one child going from 0 to 10, and especially 100, and we've seen it all. We really have. And kids escape, they'll run, that all sorts of things. When they feel that and the adrenaline kicks in, it has such a domino effect on the classroom and on a family. And so just by that child learning those skills and honing in on what do I know, what can I do, and having that calmness come, that is a big deal.
Yeah. And so that was super helpful. I've had similar ones. That's, like I said, an area that we see a lot of. And so that was one that he shared. I shared a little bit about kids sabotaging relationships.
Yeah.
And so that was one that I saw, and helping my little third grade young lady recognize what she was doing was huge. It was like this light bulb went on. And so instead of sabotaging it and starting to create this friend drama in her classroom, she was able to shift her mindset to, how can I still stay connected with my friends? And I explained to her how having internet and social media still allowed her. And she came up with this game plan of how she planned on staying connected. And that was a huge turning point for her, to recognize that just because she's leaving doesn't mean that it had to end a friendship, and how she still planned on staying connected. Other things we've seen is helping to connect to like the school culture. So this was a little fifth grader that I was working with who kept getting office referrals because of negative interactions with his peers tattling on him for using offensive language.
Yeah.
Utah has a different view of a level of language. Nothing bad about it, just culturally it's different.
Right.
A lot of times, you'll see things with taking things like pissed off. I hope I'm not offending anybody, but words like that might be okay elsewhere. Or taking the Lord's name in vain might be okay in other schools.
Where they were culturally before that, just a very common, yeah.
Yes, things like,
Say.
this sucks, or this is bad. Things that are on a level of, he's saying, well, where's that vulgar? Where's that offensive? He had that at his other school, never got in trouble for using it. And now peers were saying it. And now it was just this downward spiral. So then he started arguing with peers, and then that arguing created negative impacts in friendships. And so we sat down and we talked about expected and unexpected behaviors, and how, if I was sitting in my classroom and all of a sudden I stood up on my chair and I started screaming and yelling, would that be expected? And he goes, no. And I said, but if I was outside and I stood up on the bleachers, because we're at a sporting event, and I stood up on where I was sitting and I started screaming and yelling, would that be expected? And he's like, yes. And we talked about how what I did was the same. Still said and screamed, but the environment either expected me to behave one way or it didn't expect me to behave one way. And so we were able to process for him how the words he's using at each place were the same. But in one environment, it was expected, it was okay. In the other environment, it was unexpected, and it made people feel uncomfortable. And as he processed that and talked about that and learned that strategy and that understanding, he's like, oh, okay. And then it wasn't this negative. Now he still has some troubles with some friendships. That's still there. But he's able to recognize his whole attitude is changing. And we're still in a process of working on it, but we're seeing some changes. I just want to mention that I think is super helpful to recognize is, you asked me about those differences between when I grew up and also when I raised my kids and now. And I think part of that is that internet, that access. Yeah. So while that can be good and bad, it can create, like I mentioned with that young lady, where she can stay connected, but sometimes it can be a negative thing too. So we have to be careful. And that's one of the things, because kids can also look back and start missing what was happening. So it's helping them recognize that, because we can still see, and this can hinder them getting involved in their new area.
Sure.
So that encouragement by teachers, by school staff, to have kids get involved. If there's a class, secondary, especially club, something that they can do, a school club, involve them, get them involved, because they might still be connected to friends in other places, but they're going to miss those interactions because you're going to see it through social media. So really trying to help them. So while that's good, it also can be a hardship for kids.
Sure.
So that was one thing that I didn't have to deal with. When I left, I left. We sent letters, but that was it.
And you got them weeks later.
Yes. In fact, I tell kids when we talk about how can they connect to their dad or mom who are deployed, and I talk about a tic-tac-toe game that I played with my dad. So when my dad would go on a deployment, we'd play tic-tac-toe through the mail. So I'd put an X on the board and I'd put in the mail.
Kidding?
And 2 weeks later, he'd put an O and he'd send it back. And that's how we played games. And I have them compare that to their games that they get to play. And so there's things that are positive. So internet can be very positive. The other thing that I see that's a big challenge, and this is different than when I grew up, I think we have a lot more blended families. Yeah. And we have a lot more families that, because there are more, when you're in that military setting, you aren't just moving from one city to another city and you still get that parent time. We now might be moving across the world, many states, and that parent time becomes very hard to have. So helping and recognizing that for your student is important, especially when they hear their other peers, oh yeah, this weekend I'm going to dad's house, or this weekend I'm going somewhere, and they're missing that. That's a big thing. And that's something that's different than what I had growing up, because I didn't have as much of that, or at least I wasn't aware of it. Maybe that was it. But I think there is.
Thank you. I think it is more prevalent now, and we are a blended family, and I can understand, like, sometimes I'm just so grateful that the other parts of those families are close by. I mean, I can't even imagine how it would feel to have states or countries separate you, because it's already tricky, even just by being in the same area. So I think that's something that we have to think about, and what that child is going through, and how I can see why a child would try to sabotage for that reason. Like, everything just feels like it's all over the place, and they're just wanting to grasp onto something that makes them feel a sense of belonging. So
then the last thing is, I think we have a better awareness. And that's one of the last things that I just wanted to just kind of bring in, is we have this awareness now. States are seeing that military connected kids are impacted by their parents' deployments and relocations. And so they're looking at things like the military interstate compact that never existed when I was growing up, to address those education gaps, to address those different things that kids might have with not being able to graduate because they don't have the graduation requirements, or whatever it might be, and so there is this increase in recognizing that, for making teams like our team, because that's important. And then there's also, and I just want to give a shout out, in April, a month of the military child, and that is our Purple Up month. And that is an opportunity for communities to celebrate and thank military kids for their service.
For the sacrifice and the service. Absolutely. Thank you.
So wear purple in April, especially on Fridays, to just kind of say, hey, thank you to those
kids. What a great way to make them feel proud of, all the things that have maybe bothered them, and all the moves and all the change. But what a great way to say, you did it, and we're so proud that you're serving our country. Thank you. You have been just a dynamic interview. I think this will be really helpful to educators and parents and families, and you're a huge part of that. Your skills and talents are so on point. Thank you. You've had such a positive impact on our school. I've been reading this book called Crucial Conversations. The book is more of a business angle, but it's very applicable to relationships and in any career or anything, just by having conversation. So I like just hearing you speak today. I just keep hearing how effective conversation is and how important it is. And I just was thinking about how important it is that we know that they're a military family. We know what their background is, where they've come from, what they're doing, and what the language has been, and what the cultural differences are. Or if we don't approach those things in conversation, then they already feel a disconnect or they feel just lost. And then the behavior, because I learned this, I know this is probably one of your go-tos as as a therapist, but when I learned that all behavior is communication, that really got my brain thinking in the right direction when it comes to a child misbehaving, because it just means something and we can do something about it. So thank you for providing this for these students.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. I love it.
You are great at your job, and I hope that we can just get funding year after year. But parents, families, we just need to ask, it sounds like. Teachers, ask for these resources, ask for these programs, so we can continue to make it happen for these kids.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jen. You're amazing.
Thanks for being part of today's class. To submit a question or topic for further episodes, please email elementary.schooled@outlook.com. School is out for today, but please remember, when we strengthen a child, we strengthen society.